Hello, everybody. This is Patrick Brissett with Public Works. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on combating the toxic idea that government should be run like a business. I'm happy to be joined today by two good friends and colleagues, Joe Grady with Topos Partnership and Donald Cohen with In the Public Interest. I want to let you know that we'll make the slides that we're showing available to you all after this. Find them on our website. Other materials that are related to the topic will be posted. We're actually putting a memo to outline the kind of ideas that we'll be talking about today. So we'll get going here. As I mentioned before, here's our three presenters, myself and Joe and Donald. Check out our website for more information. Joe has been working with both of us, both of our organizations for quite a while, doing some of the core research that underpins some of the ideas we're talking about today. All of us have spent time in the field too. This topic really came to us from people we've worked with. Sheketov at Oregon, in fact, was preparing for a debate in which he was asked to actually have this debate about whether or not government should be run like a business. And he contacted us and asked if we had anything from our work that might be useful to the way he thought about that and prepared for that debate. It made us really kind of review the work that we've done, talk to Joe and talk to Donald, read what's out there on the internet, what people have said about this topic, and put together some thoughts for him in a memo. The process of doing that made us think that this might be a good topic to tackle in this format in a webinar, because it's clear that we get this kind of debate and this point made to us, those of us trying to defend government, get this kind of notion that somehow it would be better if it was run like a business. Comes up, and so we have some ideas about how to deal with that. Chances are that those of you on this call have heard someone say the government should be run like a business, and it's usually not done in a friendly way. Usually it's part of a critique or some efforts to paint government as inherently inept. So we really think, as we dug into this, that this assertion really rests on a set of kind of damaging ideas, that they could do several things. Blurs what's public and what's private, treats citizens as consumers of public services instead of civic participants and managers, and it really undermines the larger conversation we need to be having about the unique role of government in a society. But it often makes sense to people. Most of us really have a kind of a common sense understanding of what it means to run a business well, the notions of keeping costs down and providing good customer service, and so on. We also kind of revere small businessmen, the men and women that we know in our communities who are struggling every day to make a living and provide a service or a good, and we have kind of an up-close and personal experience with many of them. So it can seem obvious to apply the principles that we kind of inherently understand about business to how government should run. In large part, that's because we do not have a good shared understanding of what it means to run government well. And that's one of the gaps that we really need to fill, and we'll talk about that today, too. As we thought about this challenge, we really tried to isolate the kind of core problems that the notion of running government like a business really sets up. So it really does set up a dialogue or debate wherein business is seen as good and government somehow as bad or inferior. It really often is used to and reinforces stereotypes of waste and fraud and abuse. It limits the way we assess effectiveness and kind of the success of public programs really to just monetary measurements. So when we apply business principles to government, we're really not looking at the larger kind of social benefits. There are lots of public activities that have little obvious economic benefits, and they get obscured and belittled, in fact. As I mentioned before, it triggers kind of a consumer lens, a consumer thinking about our public services, and not the kind of public and civic stewardship we need. And we think that this kind of a conversation also really fosters the privatization of public services. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe here in a minute to really kind of lead this off, but I wanted to first kind of begin the process by talking about how we counter this dangerous frame. And Joe will begin to talk about what he thinks we should start with. So these are the points we have to make, I think, right, when we're trying to engage this debate more effectively. And we'll unpack each one of these today. First, it's important not to get trapped in this conversation and to be essentially in a debate about whether or not government should be like a business or what business principles to apply. We really really need to pivot and reframe immediately, and we have some ideas about how to do that. We need to really distinguish for people how government and business naturally operate differently, and for good reason. The notion, that government should be managed well is something we should own, and there probably are business practices that are worth applying to our management techniques and practices in the public sector. But we also want to kind of talk about the unique ways that management has to be done in a public sphere versus a private sphere. One of the unique things about government is that it is accountable to the public. That's very different than the business sector, certainly. I think that's a strength of our argument for the way we need to run our public systems. We need to talk about that. But there certainly are ways to talk about accountability that can get us in some traps, again, that kind of over-monetize and over-focus on just the kind of financial accountability. They can actually trigger kind of consumer thinking if we're not careful, so we'll dig into that. There's a tendency to try and monetize the benefits of public programs. So if we invest $1 today, we get back X dollars in the future. And while those data are sometimes useful, they can, again, trap us in a comparison about what we can get for the cheapest cost. Also, I think when we talk about business, we need to be careful and cautious about how we talk about the profit motive. There certainly are lots of ways in which profit motive is not appropriate in the public sphere, and we'll talk about those. But attacking it per se can trigger some pushback from the general public. So we'll unpack each one of these bullets as we go forward, and Joe and Donald and I will go back and forth on our comments. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end.
That obviously don't and shouldn't and never would operate on a profit basis. So this language from John Harvey in his Forbes article 2012 offers a few of those. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, police departments, fire departments, libraries, parks, etc. obviously are critical institutions to our well-being, and yet we would never expect them to operate on a profitable basis. And many of you already have examples that you probably already used, so what we're saying is we're reaffirming the value of offering clear, concrete examples as opposed to keeping the discussion at just the philosophical level. I'm going to turn it over to Donald to continue.
So I want to give just a couple of examples from from the work that we're doing about how private interests and goals, are not consistent with the public. And so let me just give you the example. So first, some of you may have seen, we did an analysis recently of private prison contracts that states had across the country with private prison companies, the major companies, Corrections Corporation of America and Geo Group, and found that in a majority, in almost 2/3, that these contracts included what we call lockup quotas or occupancy guarantees of 80%, 90%, and 100%. So in other words, that the state would either fill the beds to those levels or pay for empty beds, which we're now finding that some states are paying for empty beds also. And so it's pretty, we try to think of it dispassionately. From the prison company, from the private prison company, they're looking for certainty, rate of, return on investment, that if things change, they want not to be left on the hook. And so it's a very logical thing to put in from a business perspective, to put that in, but it is completely illogical from a public purpose perspective of public purpose and criminal justice reform. And what we'd want to do, we want to make sure that as prison populations go down, we don't pay, and in fact, we should have nothing in the system, no forces or no incentives in the system that increase the likelihood of imprisoning people that shouldn't be. So that's the first example. The profit motive just crashes with public interest. A second example folks may know about is in Chicago. The Chicago Mayor Daley sold on a 75-year long-term lease the 36,000 parking meters in the city to a consortium led by Morgan Stanley, a sovereign wealth fund from the Middle East, and one other company. And in that deal, it was a bad deal for many, many reasons, bad financially, but in that deal there were some features, contract clauses that really were fundamentally problematic for us, for democracy, and that is that if the city for 75 years is not allowed to build free parking lots downtown Chicago without making the private the private owner of the parking meters whole. At a more granular level, they can't, if they want to hold, an alderman wants to hold a street fair or a eliminate a parking spot in front of a dry cleaner so people can drop and run, they have to pay the private company for every meter used, every meter that could have been used for every hour it could have been used. So again, from a business perspective, it makes total sense. You change the rules on our deal, you should pay us. It makes total sense. But from a public purpose perspective, there ought to be no disincentives for both street fairs or changes in land use practices 50 years from now that would reduce global warming and get people out of their cars, or build community with street fairs. And so again, these are just concrete examples where profit motive, nothing wrong with it, it's legit, but it doesn't necessarily meet our interests. So when I get asked this question a lot and have for many, many years, and I actually think it's the wrong question completely. It's not about running government like a business. That's not what we need to be talking about. What we need to be talking about is good management. And in fact, because that's really the issue, there are very good management practices in the private sector that public sector organizations can run. They're simply just good things to do in terms, as management methods and techniques. So we, as progressives and those who believe in government, I think it's very important for us to not just own good management as a goal, but we ought to be the reformers without being the attackers of government. And I think it's an important space for us to maintain. So I think when I pivot, when I'm talking at this level with policymakers and folks on the ground or media, I pivot all to say it's not about running it like a business. It's like saying it's about good management. And in fact, there are businesses run well and there are businesses run extremely poorly. And that's the same is true for government agencies. Some run really well and some run poorly, and that really is the fundamental truth of any large, big organization. The issue is how what we do in the public is how we create the best management systems possible to create the best possible service at the most effective price for the high and at the highest quality. That should be our our mission. So let's talk about what we mean by good management. So again, like I said, there are certain business principles that can be applied to government. No question. I've done a lot in my trainings throughout the years. So, but the key question is, what do we mean when we are providing a service? So, SNAP, food stamps applications. We should absolutely. They should be the application process should be efficient. It should be as cheap as possible. It should be as easy as possible for recipients. But the issue is not how cheap it is. The issue is nutrition, and that it's not just to be efficiency doesn't mean cheapest. And in fact, we should be saying efficiency and effectiveness, because what our goal is that we get critical food assistance to folks so that in an accurate and in timely manner, but our goal is nutrition of low-income people in this country. And that should be, and that clearly the goal that we ought to be talking about, and that will drive us to better and better management and better uses of our resources. And you could take that example through any other area, whether it be criminal justice or transportation. We should stay focused on what we're trying to accomplish in terms of promoting the common good. So when I think it's important to talk about what we mean by management. It's not that complicated. They say we're running like a business, and they sort of conjure it up as if it's something mysterious. It's not. It's something every government ought to be doing. Clarity about goals, like in the SNAP case, good nutrition. Schools, great education. I mean, it's the product. If we were thinking purely in private sector terms, got to have a well-trained, mission-driven staff, and you certainly, I'm sure we all know, you certainly don't get that when public service workers around the country are consistently attacked as lazy, having fat pensions, unions that have too much control of that. It is not a morale builder to be attacked consistently. And we work with lots of public sector members, as I know Public Works does as well, public sector workers. We absolutely ought to be looking at our ongoing process improvements. Any organization should. It's public, private, nonprofit. That should be part of what we do, which includes training staff, which finding new folks, finding new methods. The fourth bullet is critically important, this good oversight of all functions, insourced or outsourced. It's one of the, we focus a lot, of course, on outsourced functions. It's one of the key reasons things go wrong, is you don't manage, you don't watch. That is a key function of management, is that you watch, you measure, you control, you adjust. And if you can't do that, things fail. And for all of them, you need measurement systems that track effectiveness in a real-time basis so that you can make changes and you can make sure that you're doing the most effective thing possible. And that information in a public agency should be available both to managers, to workers, that would be true in the private sector too, but also the public. And that's what ensures that we are constantly focusing towards our goals. I think that's my last slide, right?
Yeah, thanks, Donald.
Yeah.
Just to remind people that you have the ability to use a chat and question function on your system there to ask us any questions that are coming to mind as we're doing the presentation, and we'll have some Q&A as we wrap up. Another important point we think that's worth making and making as part of this debate is that government is uniquely accountable to the public, and really that is quite a bit different than what we understand of how private business operates. We have the public officials have to make decisions in public. The processes we're asking for and considering public input, and really all of those are very different from the more limited requirements that business might even consider at any point in time. I think there are some things to think about when talking about accountability. It's easy because we are kind of in this culture as well to inadvertently trigger the kind of consumer thinking or government like a business model when we talk about accountability. So I've got this little chart here that, if we were to use language that we need to run government more like a business and focus on return on investment for our customers, we are essentially triggering all of the kinds of consumer thinking ideas where government should be just doing something that's as cheap as possible, and I only really care about it if I'm getting my particular benefit out of it. When we focus on doing this because we need to account for every tax dollar for people's money, I mean, these are kind of over-the-top examples, obviously, but I think it's really easy for us to slip into some of this language when we are talking about the importance of accountability. And also, we certainly need to avoid trying to talk to people as consumers of public services, but always be evoking a different kind of perspective. So we've worked with some public managers, actually, just to get them themselves, even when dealing with their constituents, constantly trying to be reinforcing more of a citizen perspective, even when they're talking about the details of accountability and transparency and efficiency, to set that tone by saying the reason to do this is really because it's important to be good stewards of these public systems that we all rely on. And as Donald just mentioned, and how we measure this and why it's important to be efficient is because we're trying to achieve specific kind of results for the public good, not just monetary savings. And then I think, again, how we speak about what this is about. So we're using the tools of government to improve our quality of life for the people and communities around us. And that, again, is the goal and the reason that you're trying to make sure that we have good management, that we have systems that track our accountability, et cetera, but not just, as you see in the top line, a model that is really kind of limited to this government as business frame and private interest and consumer thinking. Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about some of your work on this notion of public accountability and how that played out?
Yeah, and this builds on the points Patrick was just making about two different visions of accountability, and it's not exactly in the nature of an answer to the question of whether government should be run more like a business, but it is very relevant to how people think about these questions of accountability. In some research that we did with Donald and his group, Topos found that there was one really clear way of talking about why privatization is a bad idea, and this boils down to essentially the idea that privatization amounts to handing over control of important resources and systems and institutions to private interests who may or may not run them the way we would like them run. And this core image of handing over control really was powerful. We found it that way in our research, and I think Donald and his allies have found it that way in their field experience. A powerful way of immediately realigning people's thinking so that they see government and us as one thing. That is, right now we are in control, and once we hand over our highways or our prisons or our schools or what have you, now a private interest is in control that may or may not run things in our interest. And as Donald points out all the time, they usually don't. So this is one tool we might want to keep in our back pocket as a way of quickly painting a picture for people that helps them see the value of maintaining public control and public accountability over all kinds of systems and resources.
I want to add a little bit on this point that Joe said it was the research he had done for us. It was, I want to say, first off, it was the, in all of my years, this was the most effective and successful and productive public opinion research I have ever been a part of in terms of my work. It has completely transformed how we talk about things in pretty fundamental ways, not just in a global way, but actually on the ground. It has helped campaigns shift from one side to the other. And it did it in a couple of big ways, and then I'll talk about how we use it. First, it really fundamentally took us from the defense to the offense. As normally what we were saying as well, privatization, the quality goes down, the costs, on the defense. They say it saves money, we say no it doesn't. We talk about workers' wages and benefits, which in fact do go down. But this took all of that and turned it into about what the private sector does for us. There's lots of contracting. We're not going to eliminate government contracting, but to make sure that we can have the best possible contracting or no contracting where not appropriate. So that's the first thing it did. The second thing it does for us, while we talk about we talk about all sectors, social services, prisons, et cetera, it enabled us to go from the transactional issues that we do talk about to the fundamental issues in pretty profound ways. I could go on for quite some time. We've used this a lot. We've used lots of trainings. Lots of trainings that we've done in union halls and community groups and all that. The last thing I'll say is we do have we have not put this stuff on our website, but we have an executive summary, a more in-depth report, and a very valuable person on the street interviews that we did as the last part of the research that we have a YouTube link to it, but we don't want to. So, but if folks want access to that, allies want access to that, we're happy to give it to us. Just send us an email and we'll do it, or I'll work with Patrick on that. It's quite useful.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Al.
Yeah, I'll just reaffirm that the video is the quickest and most concrete way of seeing how this kind of perspective can really quickly change the conversation in a constructive way. The next slide, I won't say much about it. It's just another way of playing out this point that right now there are critically valuable resources and systems and so forth that we've built, that we've worked hard to create, the public works that we worked hard to create, and that it makes no sense to take those out of our hands and put them in other people's hands. So this is another way of expressing that point.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention about this whole speech that she gave is quite powerful defense of public goods. And when we post the slides from this webinar on our website and give you access to that, we have a study letter links, things that we've been reading, and some of the quotes you've seen here that we lifted from essays, speeches like this. We'll try to make sure that those are available to everybody as well. There's actually a fair number of people taking on this debate, I think, in some creative ways. So we'll try to put up our favorite versions of that for you. Another point that we run across in the field a fair amount, and that I think has the danger of reinforcing some of this government-like business model, is an instinct that I think many of us as advocates over the years have drifted into, which is to lean heavily on making the kind of economic case for some of the programs we care about. So a classic one is how, for every dollar we spend on palliative care and education, we get back X dollars in savings over the life of that child or something like that. But I think it's really important for us to recognize that the reason we're doing that, or trying to push for something like universal pre-K, is not primarily because it has a monetary return, but really for its incredible social value and connection to building a good society. Similarly, Medicaid, may in fact be more efficient, as we know it is, with private health care. But that's, again, not the primary reason that we might be defending that program or trying to get more funding for it or expanding it. So I think that some of us sometimes fall into a trap of leading with those economic arguments. And I think they really set the playing field, again, more in this kind of consumer, government-like business accountability frame that can be dangerous. People can always argue, well, can we get it cheaper? Or I think it also opens the door in some troubling ways to privatization. So somebody comes along and wants to offer to do the same service for a cheaper dollar amount. You lose the conversation, as Donald said, at a higher level, a meta level, about the kind of public goals and public kind of responsibilities that we're really trying to think about. So again, I know this is difficult because this is important data that we often have about these programs. And I think that what we're arguing is not that these notions of them being good investments over time are not useful, but they should be a secondary point. So you have to first really make the case for why these public programs are of value, meet larger social goals, and by the way, they're also a great use of our public resources for the following reasons. So I'm not suggesting we dump all that important data, but I think we have to be careful about overemphasizing it as the reason to support these programs. So return on investment, which some of us, advocates use in some of their defense of programs, really should not be our primary argument. I think that's something to be careful for in the work that we do in the field. Joe, this is a caution you raised I thought was an important one. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so in all of our work, Topos's work and our work with Patrick and Donald, we consistently find that Americans are of two minds about profit. They can easily see in the right context how profit can lead us, a profit motive can lead us down the wrong roads, but they also have a very strong default sense that a profit motive is what makes American business strong and has contributed profoundly to American prosperity and American society overall. So we find that we have to be very careful with how we talk about profit and the profit motive. Naturally, there's some existing audience for any kind of demonization of profit seeking, but rather than just reaching some of the people some of the time, in order to reach broader audiences and get them on our side about these points, we want to be very careful about how we handle that. So what it basically boils down to is, rather than assuming that a profit motive is a negative and dismissing business because it has a profit motive, or dismissing privatization because then we're talking about a profit motive, rather than being that simple about it, we need to offer people clear examples, as Donald has a couple times in this call already, clear examples of how profit motive, while fine, can lead us down the wrong road when it comes to public needs and public priorities and public systems. So, for example, a profit motive leads you, in the case of a prison, to want more people in more beds. That's how you make your profit. But obviously, from our point of view as a society, we want fewer people in prison. A profit motive for a business leads you to want more parking meters charging more per hour. As a city, we may have very good reasons to want free parking available to people at certain times and places. So again, to sum up, the key is to not assume that people are going to be with us just because we attack a profit motive, but instead, when the context calls for it, to offer simple, clear examples of how the profit motive can sometimes lead us to the wrong decisions that clash with our interests.
Thanks, Joe. So to kind of sum up some of these points, obviously I think if you're on this call, you probably share our views that the notion of running government like a business would be a bad choice, but often also recognizing it's a pretty powerful line of thinking and a frame for the conversation. And so the kind of ideas we've laid out and that you'll see when you get a chance to have the slides, we're also writing up a memo with a little bit longer explanation of some of the points that are made here today that will be posted along with this material. But just to reiterate the points we've gone over, one is to really, if you get confronted in a debate or confronted with this question, shouldn't we just run government more like a business, to not get trapped in that conversation and really pivot and reframe it immediately back onto terrain that is really about the unique purpose and role of government. Use some examples to distinguish how government and business naturally operate differently, and we heard some of those today. Dial, I think, has a really good advice. So one of the key points to pivot to quickly is to really own the notion of good management and own that for the right public reasons, not just for doing things as cheaply as possible. There are lots of ways, and I think good concrete examples of how government is accountable in unique ways to the public and to the public interest, and that those are things you don't want to give up and are really stark contrast to the business world in particular. And then the other point we made is about talking about accountability carefully, so we're not inadvertently reinforcing just kind of monetary accountability and more consumer thinking. Being careful not to lead with or only lean on too much the notion that certain public public programs save money. And then again, this point about being cautious about the profit motive. So those are the key points, and they'll be expanded on in the memo that will accompany these slides. I appreciate everybody listening in. We've actually gotten a handful of pretty great questions, and so I'm going to open them up and see if our wise panel here can take a look at them with me. Hang on with just a second. Just to remind people who might just be turning their attention to some questions, you can use the kind of chat function, question function to send us anything that you've got. So I'm going to read them out loud just so everybody can hear. Here's one that we've got from Mike. One of the challenges we hear these days around public pensions, that we should have defined contribution plans rather than defined benefit plans, et cetera. So one, focus on the reason for pensions is to provide secure retirement, and two, the private sector should do this too. Can't we say that business should run like government on that issue? Any thoughts on that, those who might have come up against the pension fight, Joe or Don?
Well, we come up on it all the time, so I think the first thought is right. We have to be talking about what secure retirement looks like. Most, we work with lots of folks, blue-collar and white-collar people in government, that, that don't have huge pensions, and in fact, some governments don't, in fact, have opted out of Social Security, so that's all they have. So, it's an aspiration we should all have, is a decent, secure retirement. Having said that, I can't comment to the truth of all the claims. There are certainly some governments that are paying big bills, and some, pretty underfunded pensions. But there have been some, and it's worth pointing out, there have been some really bad management practices that were done in the name of running like a business that caused these funds to be underfunded. The investments in risky derivatives, the uses of surplus when there weren't really surpluses. So there are actually some bad things that happened, but it was a management question of how the funds were invested, not an overpromising. Now, of course, what our opponents point to is the one manager has worked all his life and is making gets a $150,000 pension. Those things are true, and we would support capping those.
Thanks, Donald. Joe, do you have anything to add, or should I move on to another question we got?
Just to reaffirm that it's always a good idea to not concede that business does anything better. So the point that Donald raises that maybe businesses should be doing it more like governments do in some cases.
Great. Andrew from California says that he recently spoke to some state policymakers about the importance of government in protecting public health in a free market society. So the venue was pretty friendly. Policymakers who were considering sponsoring taxes on sugary drinks, et cetera, they still were questioning him over the ability to show a cost benefit of the public policy as much as a more general quality of life improvement. So he's asking, when decision makers are already kind of operating in that kind of cost benefit mindset, what to do about falling back on a social value, nonprofit values of government conversation. Just interested in our thoughts about navigating that particular kind of a circumstance.
Joe, why don't you go first?
Well, I think it's always helpful to start by reaffirming the mission we're talking about. Why did we create this? Why did we create public health systems? Why do we have health policy at all? Why do we as a society or a community or a state think about those topics and set up institutions for them? So it's always good to start with that affirmative. And then, since the question is being asked, and leaders may need some numbers in their back pocket that they can use to rationalize a particular position or policy or intervention, then sure, why not support that with, and it also has the following economic benefits, and sometimes even, dollars and cents benefits. But that overall, that should probably be the secondary point rather than the leading point.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that, particularly on the point of obesity and sugar, and soda and all that, because I've actually done some work on that. I think what I do is the first thing is to acknowledge the problem. We have an obesity crisis, so that the context is always what the problem is that we absolutely need to solve. The second thing that I often do is I want to talk about the private interests. Is in fact Coca-Cola's objective private interest to sell as much Coca-Cola as possible. They want us to drink more than we should drink. And I say there's nothing wrong with that. That's what they do. But but that's not necessarily, and that's true of all food manufacturers. Their goal is to get us to eat more. That's not in the public interest to do. It doesn't advance public health to do that. And then finally, on the issue of costs, I think it's worth talking about costs in the broadest possible way, because it's kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, okay, we're not going to, it may cost the Coke company something right now, but think of what it's costing us down the line. And you can try to add it up. We've done some work trying to add up the indirect costs, and everybody's done that of the impacts on the public health system. But even at sort of a common sense level, people get that prevention's cheaper than fixing things on the back end. I think it's worth sort of talking about that at both levels, both giving some examples of costs, but also staying, reaffirming the common sense part of that.
No, that's helpful. I think another thing that I see happening in some of these debates like this is that cost-benefit analysis is often very kind of short-term in its brackets, and we kind of forget that we've got, even in some cases, generations of public investments in these systems that make it possible for us to respond. And we're really talking about cost and benefit to be real about the long-term nature of these public things that we've built. I've got a question from our friend Jennifer Ricari. So I was just curious about where the concept of kind of tax fairness and public workers' commitment to supporting strong systems factor into this discussion. She finds that they don't have the revenue resources to support the strong systems, and we need to talk about this in some way, but I don't want to trigger the consumer thinking. So Jennifer, I'll take a first shot at it. I think that we do still need to make the case for what is this funding we're seeking trying to achieve and support, and we can make that, I think, through this lens of a discussion about the importance of these public systems. Whatever kind of details we have about the data on that and about what that might be good examples of that are useful. But I still think it's, you're on the right track. I've seen the work that you're all doing at AFT. I think that what you're trying to avoid as far in these tax conversations is people judging that tax debate only by what they might pay individually, or some sort of argument that says, well, you're only going to have to pay X percent on your next bill. We get into a trap, I think, when we talk about those particulars of the tax policy and don't always frame them by the larger goals that we're trying to achieve and how those will benefit individuals in the community and what that ripple effect might be. So did you have anything to add to that one?
I think you summed it up well, Patrick.
Yeah, I'll add something, Patrick, just Jennifer. It's very clear that revenue is a part of the problem, but it's not a winner at this point. I very unscientifically believe that most, from my observations, believe that most people think the money's there and it's just being wasted. So, Joe's done good work on that, and so is Public Works. I do think for sort of our, folks in the labor movement and the progressive movement, we ought to not just, because I've been in lots of situations on the ground where people say it's not our fault, there's just not enough money as the only answer. And I think we have to do parallel track. And we have to figure out how to bring the you get what you pay for discussion. The things we value we should pay for. But I also think we should be looking at ways to make things better at the same time. And and how to be the reformers at the same time. It's obviously very challenging.
Our friend Amy from Ohio says that she really shares our concern about overly monetizing conversations on things like Medicaid and universal pre-K. She's curious about whether or not there's any contradiction in what how we might talk about the minimum wage, that we have to emphasize how it strengthens the economy rather than just starting with our desire to have a society in which everyone is paid at a basic level of decency. And to show you've just been recently doing some work on this. I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think there's a number of things to say, but to keep it brief, one point to remember is that, well, first of all, businesses are not public systems and structures, so we may have to talk a little bit differently about how we as a society want to impose requirements on businesses than the way we would talk about how we want to run our public institutions. But that said, I still think you have a very good point that we want to question the kind of dollars and cents version of talking about the value of increasing a minimum wage, for example. And I do think in our work on these issues, but also on various other issues, and I'll mention one as far off from what we're talking about now as the arts. So in work on the arts, we found that there was a big difference between trying to frame support for the arts in terms of the dollars and cents value it brings to a city, like literally in economic development. Arts has economic development, as opposed to painting a broader picture of how when there are galleries and theaters and festivals and so forth in a community, it creates a more vibrant community that ends up attracting people, attracting residents, attracting businesses, and so forth. And it was much more effective with people. Here we're talking about the effectiveness of framing. It was much more effective to paint that picture for people of a more vibrant and attractive and thriving community than it was to talk about the dollars and cents value of the arts, because people were inclined to reject that frame and say, well, there's got to be other ways of attracting businesses to a community, et cetera. But when we painted the picture of a vibrant, thriving community that people were attracted to, then people naturally said, yeah, that is the kind of community we want to create, and that has a lot of value. And so when we're talking about various public systems and institutions, too, we might want to think whether there are two different ways of talking that are both economic, broadly speaking, but that play out quite differently.
No, I think that's interesting, because you're still telling the story of the impact on the economy, but I think your notion of painting the picture of how that actually happens and giving some vivid images for people to kind of latch onto may be applicable to this kind of minimum wage argument as well.
It is, and in that work that we've done, which is for the Ford Foundation, we aren't offering a dollars and cents kind of argument. We're never using any numbers along those lines, but what we are doing is painting a picture for people of a thriving community that requires people, it means people going out and buying the basics in their communities and keeping businesses open and so forth. When you paint that picture, that's quite different from telling a dollars and cents story with numbers.
Yeah. We've got a question from Amber, who's asked, is there another way to discuss the public good without using the words the public good, which seem to be code words these days for socialism, both among extremists and increasingly among some moderates? Well, how about we pitch that one to the linguist first?
Yeah, I don't recall myself using the phrase public good much when I talk about any of this, but on the other hand, it'd make me angry to concede that phrase can't be used anymore. But there's all kinds of ways of making this point, and we've probably used a few in this discussion. I think we can talk about all the things we've created for our quality of life and our prosperity and then give examples. So that's one way, and Patrick and Donald, I know you have other ways that you'd like to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're trying to do is get people to be thinking about what is in the public interest and in the public good, and there are probably lots of different creative ways to do that by pointing attention to, as Joe already said, the many public systems around us and the role that they play in our quality of life, and really give examples of that. I think always helps. You run across this in your work, Donald? Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the subtext to a lot of what we do. I write the phrase on some of the things we write. I always feel like I'm speaking gobbledygook when I use that term, frankly. I mean, I'm not gobbledygook, but just not something that deeply connects with people. I think what you said, Patrick, was key as examples. I mean, it's the best way to describe it. Sort of examples that connect with people's common sense, right? On this issue of, I talk about, people know what a good society is. They know what a good neighborhood is. They know what a good family is. They sort of have a mental image of all that, and I think the more we can connect with that, with sort of practical examples and stories, I think the better.
And just to reaffirm that, in the work that we did with you, Donald, about handing over control, about privatization, I don't think we ever used the phrase public good, but when we said that privatization amounts to handing over control of things that are important to us, that was another way of conveying the very basic point.
There's something I think we ought to, I think another point to think about is, as a woman is advocating the use of the word public goods to talk about those things. I don't think we should peel off now on that, but it'd be interesting to think about that in a different way. Like the things that are inherently public as a first. So anyway, just a comment.
Yeah, there's And we might put some links up to the kind of, an increasing commons movement and a website on the commons that really is trying to reclaim some of these notions of the commons and the public good. And they've got some interesting things that they've been doing around the country in that too. So maybe we can add a link to their work when we post this material. We got a last question from Michael LaCour, actually our board chair. Thanks, Michael, for tuning in. He is observing that public education at the K through 12 level is often viewed as inferior to private education. Just wants to know what our views on why this is so and how we can turn it around. There's a big challenge, obviously. Joe or Donald, do you want to jump in on that one?
He said public seem to be inferior? Yeah, I didn't hear it. He said the public is inferior to private?
Yeah, he's just saying why is the public education viewed as inferior to private education, and what has happened, why is that so, and how can we turn it around?
Well, it'd be good if we could unmute Jen Picard. She would have far more to say. If there's a way to do that, go ahead. I just don't think it's true. It's a big discussion, right? For one, there's lots of good public education. There's lots of good public schools. So that's number one. Number two is, we're starting to do a lot on private charters, for-profit charters, and there's some horrible cases of what of bad education, in terms of the numbers, and we could link up some studies and send them to you about how these charters are just not measuring up on the basic numbers and measures of education. And then finally, the other thing we're paying attention to is sort of these, when you financialize and profitize education, you get some of the same distortions. You get fraud, you get CEO salaries, you get, failed institutions that go bankrupt and close down and then pop up with another name the next day. So, there's actually a lot of examples to say the private sector. Now, again, there may be some technique, right, that some entrepreneur figures out how to deliver things, great, and you should use those. Those things are neutral. But this idea that if we're just going to give, I live in LA, the idea that we're going to give everybody an iPad is turning out to be not so, it had to be problematic. And so I think we need to sort of, again, go back to what we're talking about and want to give a good experience to kids in classrooms and deal with it as AFT and Randy Weingarten talks about a lot, is sort of the whole child. You can't teach a kid in poverty the same you could teach a kid coming from a middle-class neighborhood.
I'd like to add a comment that's not specific to education, but more broadly about Michael, this broader pattern that public transportation is worse than private transportation. The post office is worse than FedEx, et cetera, et cetera. And we were interested to see in some work from years ago that a lot of Bay Area residents, San Francisco Bay Area residents, kind of tend to think of BART as a private thing, or at least used to, because it was clean and efficient and modern. So they didn't even think of it as public sometimes. So there's this general tendency to condemn public systems and assume that private ones are better because they're going to be cleaner, more modern, shinier, prettier, et cetera. And this is not a tested response to that, but it's an interesting possibility to challenge that perspective, is to say, well, yeah, that's true. We do tend to underfund a lot of public systems. We don't put enough money into public schools to have the buildings look as nice as some other buildings do. We don't put enough money into the post office. If we want it shiny, yeah, we should invest more in it. That's not a tested response, but it's an interesting point to think about.
Yeah, just to take it on directly. Yeah, there's actually also a couple essays I've read that really also challenge the notion that the more we have come to view children as products of an education system, kind of we're producing economic widgets, if you will, that it has led to this notion that a more of a business model or a private model might inherently produce that object better, and that we've lost some of the debate about the unique public role of education and even the founding reasons for creating a universal public education system. And there's a couple of interesting essays that I'll dig up and certainly try and include that really, again, I think in some ways similar to the points we've been making today, really challenge us to be articulating the unique kind of public role and purpose of public education among one of our most important public systems, obviously.
Yeah, and let me add one point, Patrick, Donald. I think even at a practical level as well, if you let a look around right now in terms of what the jobs are, literature and psychology and sociology, in fact, are far more valuable to a nation of consumer service providers, right? Customer service providers. And now, the push is for high tech, for science and tech, and that's all very important. But I don't think, when we talk about, it's really problematic when we, at a deeper level, that when we eliminate arts and science, and arts and phys ed and literature, it's not just those are good things that should be part of people's lives. I think those are fundamental things to sort of a good nation and a good life, and we should be talking about that.
Our friend Chuck in Oregon jumped on. He says he wonders if people have a positive view of business in the abstract, but negative of that particular company. He says, if so, can't we use that to our advantage? Like, do you want J.P. Morgan in charge of tax collections? That kind of a highlighting an example. It says it's actually Juan from Oregon, Jonathan, and probably from Chuck's shop. I know that in our work with you, Joe, and some of the early government and economy work, it was clear that the notion of rogue businesses was treated a little bit differently than kind of business in general. Did you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, just to say that definitely there are moments and places where a business can stand for bad practices. There can be a rogue business that people identify with dishonesty or greed or cheating or polluting a particular river or something like that. But so sure, we can use those when they arise, but we want to be pretty careful overall with assuming that people are going to be on our side when we condemn corporations, because they have a pretty mixed set of feelings about them.
Yeah, I guess I may differ just a little bit. I think we have to have an affirmative, program and a program. We have to have defense and offense. Or it's not the right metaphor here, I don't think. But I think it's absolutely very appropriate to point to the bad practices of businesses, of individual cases. I think that's maybe where you probably agree, Joe. It's not that we're saying business is bad, the profit motive, capitalism, all that stuff. But in fact, there are, we should point to the bad experiences as a way to say, no, we don't want J.P. Morgan in control of our stuff. Look at what happened to the market when you add unregulated markets. It's not the only way to do things. We found that pretty helpful.
Oh, I absolutely agree that that's helpful, and part of the reason it's helpful is because it helps people understand. Part of what we're achieving in all these communications is helping paint a picture for people who don't usually think about these issues the way we do. So we want them we want to connect the dots for them. So part of what you're talking about right now, Donald, is painting the dots for people about here's exactly how this company ended up screwing this town or all of us or whatever. The caution I was raising was when we just mention a particular company without connecting the dots for people and assume that people are going to be on our side in hating the company. We just want to be careful and be sure we know that they do.
That's helpful. Well, we're just about out of time, and it looks like we're out of questions. So I want to just kind of wrap up here in the last minute. Just say I really appreciate the several dozens of people who joined us today. I'm glad that you're interested in the topic. We'll make sure we post materials from this, and as I said, we're wrapping up a memo that kind of expands on some of the points, much as we did in today's conversation. I want to thank Joe and Donald for joining us. Great to have you on the webinar, and I hope we get to do it again in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.